So Andrew Parker Bowles just opened a leather-bound journal that's been sealed shut for 30 years. And what's written inside completely destroys the story the palace has been selling since 1995. Because this was never a quiet divorce between a gentleman and his wife, it was an institutional operation designed to protect a future king, and Andrew Parker Bowles paid for it with everything he owned. Before we get into this, hit subscribe real quick. We dig up receipts on this channel that nobody else is talking about, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Okay, so let's actually start where this whole thing begins, because the timeline here is honestly wild once you see it laid out. So here's the part that actually gets crazy. Andrew Parker Bowles did not receive a single penny from Charles during the divorce. Not one. For 30 years, the entire country believed Charles quietly paid him off, that there was some kind of golden handshake buried in the paperwork. That was the story everyone accepted without question. And it was completely wrong. Land registry records from that spring show something else entirely. Andrew actually turned down the financial packages the palace legal team put in front of him. He walked away from Middlewick House, the grand Wiltshire estate he'd shared with Camilla, with basically nothing but his standard military pension. The house itself had to be sold just to cover the mortgages that had piled up during those final chaotic years of the marriage. And honestly, that's the detail that made everyone stop cold when it started circulating. Because if there was no payoff, if there was no quiet financial reward for stepping aside gracefully, then why did a decorated brigadier just walk away from his entire life without a fight? Here's the thing, the man had spent his career as an officer in the Blues and Royals. He'd served as Silver Stick in waiting to Queen Elizabeth II. This wasn't some minor aristocrat who could disappear into obscurity without anyone noticing. Andrew Parker Bowles was somebody, and he let the entire country brand him a failure. A complacent husband who just let it all happen without ever once defending himself. Like, this is where it stops being just a family story and starts looking like something else, something colder. Because in January of 1995, Andrew sat in a London law office surrounded by high-ranking palace courtiers and legal advisors. On the table were divorce papers with a standard non-disclosure clause that would legally silence him for the rest of his life. And the pressure he faced in that room wasn't about money at all. It went straight for the two things he actually cared about: his military loyalty and his children. I genuinely think that's what makes this different from every. So here's the part that actually gets crazy. Andrew Parker Bowles did not receive a single penny from Charles during that divorce. Not one. For 30 years, the accepted story was that Charles quietly paid him off some kind of golden handshake tucked into the settlement to make him disappear gracefully. That's what everyone believed, and it was completely wrong. Land registry records from that exact spring tell a different story. Andrew actually refused the financial packages the palace legal team offered him. He walked away from Middlewick House, the grand Wiltshire estate he'd shared with Camilla, with basically nothing but his standard military pension. The house had to be sold just to cover mortgages that had piled up during the final chaotic years of the marriage. And honestly, that's the detail that stops people cold when they hear it. Because if there was no payoff, if there was no quiet financial reward for stepping aside, then why did a decorated brigadier just walk away from his entire life without putting up a fight? Here's the thing, this wasn't some minor aristocrat who could vanish into obscurity. Andrew Parker Bowles served as an officer in the Blues and Royals. He held the position of Silver Stick in waiting to Queen Elizabeth II. He literally protected the monarch during state occasions. And he let the entire country brand him a failure. The complacent husband who just looked the other way without ever once defending himself in public. Like, this is where it stops being just a messy family story and starts looking like something else, something a lot colder. Because in January of 1995, Andrew sat in a London law office surrounded by high-ranking palace courtiers and legal advisors. Divorce papers sat on the table in front of him, attached to a standard non-disclosure clause that would legally silence him for the rest of his life. And the pressure in that room wasn't really about money. It went straight for the two things he actually cared about: his military loyalty and his two children, Tom and Laura. I genuinely think that's what separates this story from the usual royal divorce narrative. This wasn't a man choosing peace over conflict. This was a man being systematically boxed into a corner by people who understood exactly which levers to pull. And the part that still doesn't add up even now is the timing. Charles had already gone on national television the year before admitting to infidelity, which left Andrew looking like the most publicly humiliated husband in Britain. Everyone assumed the divorce that followed was just cleanup, a formality. But internal accounts from that period paint something far more calculated, a room full of people deciding in advance exactly how much this one man was going to lose and exactly how they were going to make sure he never said a word about it. So he signed. He agreed to become the villain of the story. And he spent the next 3 decades letting the world believe a version of events that wasn't true while carrying the actual one in silence. But what Andrew Parker Bowles was quietly documenting in the background in notebooks nobody knew existed. That's the part nobody saw coming. Now here's what makes this even more significant. To understand why Andrew's silence was worth so much to the palace, you actually have to understand what a royal divorce trial would have exposed back in 1995. We're not talking about a simple custody dispute here. If Andrew Parker Bowles had contested the divorce and pushed to expose the real timeline of Charles and Camilla's relationship, the legal discovery process would have dragged the entire royal family through open court. Depositions, financial audits, sworn testimony, and at the center of all of it, a demand for a full audit of the Duchy of Cornwall's private accounts. Let me show you what that actually means because it's bigger than it sounds. The Duchy of Cornwall isn't some ceremonial title. It's a private estate worth hundreds of millions of pounds, generating income for Charles, personally funded in large part by rent from tenant farmers across the country. An audit like that would have shown in specific numbers exactly how much wealth was flowing into the future king's pockets at a moment when Britain was in the middle of a painful recession and ordinary people were struggling to pay their own bills. That's the mechanism. That's what was actually at stake behind closed doors. Not a marriage. An entire financial structure that the monarchy desperately needed to keep out of public view. And this is where Lord Goodman enters the picture. A legendary, genuinely feared legal fixer in London quietly visiting the Wiltshire area under a false name since late 1994. He wasn't representing Charles directly. He was working for a secretive committee of senior politicians and Crown advisors who had already concluded that a contested divorce could trigger something close to a constitutional crisis, the monarchy potentially losing its sovereign grant altogether. So when you ask why Andrew Parker Bowles was pressured so intensely to sign quietly and disappear, this is the actual answer. It was never really about protecting Charles's reputation. It was about protecting the institution's money. And here's the detail that signals something darker underneath all of this. Andrew wasn't just being asked to stay quiet about a marriage. He was being asked to protect a financial system worth far more than his own home, his own career, his own name, and he was the only person standing between that system and public exposure. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere else in London, a different file was already being prepared. One that had nothing to do with money at all. But to truly understand why Andrew Parker Bowles could carry all of this without ever cracking, you have to go back further. Back to May of 1991 to a hospitality tent at the Badminton horse trials soaked through with rain and country-set champagne. Most people remember Princess Diana as the wounded party in all of this. What most people forget is a specific moment that happened years before the divorce was even final, a moment that changed how Andrew understood his entire situation. Diana walked directly toward him that day, flanked by 2 protection officers away from the press corps trapped behind barriers in the downpour. For about 3 minutes, the most photographed woman in the world stood inches from the husband of her husband's mistress. And she told him something that honestly still gives me chills thinking about it. She said they were both being treated as operational variables by the same people at Buckingham Palace. She warned him his phones were being monitored, not to catch him doing anything wrong, but to track how much he knew about Charles and Camilla. And here is the part that genuinely turns the stomach. Within 48 hours, Andrew used his own military clearance to quietly investigate the security around his own home. What he found confirmed everything Diana had told him, a surveillance device planted inside the telephone junction box outside his Wiltshire residence, actively recording conversations with his children, his officers, his own wife. Like, this is not a small detail. This is a man who spent his entire adult life defending the realm, surviving deployments in Northern Ireland, serving with total loyalty to the crown, discovering that the same institution he swore an oath to was treating him like a threat to be monitored. That's the wound underneath everything else. It's not really about Camilla. It's about realizing the machine you dedicated your life to never actually saw you as a person worth protecting, just a variable to be managed. And that realization is exactly why years later, when the palace came asking for his silence, Andrew didn't fight back with lawyers or public statements. He'd already learned back in that tent in the rain that the fight was never going to be fair. But what he did instead, quietly, patiently over the following years, was start building a file of his own. And that file was about to become a lot more dangerous than anyone at the palace realized. And this is the detail that stopped me cold when I first read it. Because the palace didn't just threaten Andrew's finances or his marriage. At one point, they weaponized the deaths of his own soldiers. Let me walk you through this properly. Back in July of 1982, an Irish Republican Army nail bomb tore through a household cavalry escort on South Carriage Drive. 4 soldiers and 7 horses were killed. Andrew, then a commanding officer, arrived at the scene within minutes and personally pulled survivors from the wreckage. The public saw him as a rock during the regiment's darkest hour. What almost nobody saw was the file that followed. That investigation was compiled into a government folder called Operation Ironclad, sealed under a 40-year secrecy rule and stored in a Ministry of Defense basement. And in 1993, as the marital crisis between Charles and Camilla reached its peak, a duplicate copy of that folder landed on the desk of Sir Michael Peat, the man overseeing the royal family's financial restructuring. The plan was staggering in its calculation. Sir Michael sat across from Andrew at the Cavalry and Guards Club on Piccadilly and laid a single page from that file on the table. It showed that a junior officer under Andrew's command had flagged a suspicious vehicle near Hyde Park 3 days before the bombing, a warning that got buried in barracks paperwork. As commanding officer, that administrative failure legally sat on Andrew's shoulders. Does any of that sound like institutional respect for a man who pulled his own men out of burning wreckage? Or does it sound like blackmail wearing a military uniform? Sir Michael made the threat completely clear without ever raising his voice. If Andrew fought the divorce, if he pushed to expose Charles's timeline with Camilla, the palace would let the press discover that the regiment ignored a direct warning. It would destroy the honor of the Blues and Royals. It would tarnish the memory of 4 dead soldiers, all to win a public relations war over a royal marriage. And here's what makes this so brutal. Andrew knew the real cause of that administrative delay was a government-ordered staff shortage, nothing to do with his own competence. But he also knew the British press would run the headline without ever checking the details. The palace hadn't just found a pressure point. They'd found the one thing Andrew genuinely could not survive: losing the honor of the men who served under him. So he stayed silent. He let the quiet divorce timeline play out exactly the way the palace wanted, because the alternative meant watching his soldiers' names dragged through tabloid mud for a scandal that had nothing to do with them. But as Andrew packed up his personal papers ahead of his own retirement in 1994, he noticed something Sir Michael Peat had left behind on that table at the Cavalry and Guards Club, something nobody in that meeting was ever supposed to see. Okay, so here's the part that actually changes everything. Sir Michael Peat had left a photocopy of that Operation Ironclad extract sitting on the table, and Andrew slipped it into his pocket without a word. It sat forgotten for months, tucked among his personal files. Then, going through his papers before retirement, Andrew flipped it over and noticed something on the back, a digital timestamp printed from a computer terminal inside the cabinet office. And the date on that timestamp matched the exact morning Charles approved his own upcoming national television confession. Think about what that actually means. The blackmail file threatening Andrew's soldiers and the plan to publicly humiliate him through Charles's confession weren't 2 separate decisions made independently. They came from the same office on the same morning. 2 coordinated operations run by the same people aimed at the same man. What Andrew found in that single sheet of paper changed the entire picture. This wasn't a marriage falling apart in front of the cameras. This was a planned, institutional campaign, timed and coordinated down to the hour, designed to isolate one loyal officer and force him out of his own life with total precision. And here's the question that opens up immediately once you see that timestamp: if the palace was willing to coordinate a national broadcast and a blackmail threat on the exact same morning, what else had they already planned in advance? How far back did this actually go? Because remember, this was the same year Diana had already warned him back in that hospitality tent that both of their marriages were being treated as expendable. At the time, that warning sounded almost paranoid. Now, holding a document that proved two separate palace operations were literally synchronized to the same date, it didn't sound paranoid anymore. It sounded like confirmation. Andrew locked the time-stamped photocopy inside his secure locker at Household Cavalry headquarters. He had no intention of using it to blackmail the future king back. That was never who he was. But its existence meant something important. The palace could force his silence. They could take his house, his marriage, his public reputation. What they couldn't do was erase the proof that their victory had been built through cold, deliberate institutional pressure rather than a simple, honest divorce. And that's genuinely the turning point in this whole story. Because up until this moment, Andrew had been reacting, absorbing pressure, losing ground on every front. But holding that piece of paper, he finally had something the palace didn't know he had. The question now wasn't whether he'd fight back publicly. He'd already decided he wouldn't. The question was what he was actually going to do with the one piece of leverage nobody at the palace knew existed. He didn't make a speech. He didn't give an interview. He didn't even confront Sir Michael Pete about the timestamp. Andrew Parker Bowles just quietly locked a single photocopy inside a secure military locker, and in doing that, he permanently changed the terms of his own silence. Now, some of you are probably asking why that small, quiet act actually mattered. Here's why. As long as that document sat untouched in a cabinet office file, the palace controlled the entire narrative with zero risk. But once Andrew secured his own copy backed by his personal logs and his knowledge of exactly how the Operation Ironclad threat had been coordinated, the palace's position was no longer risk-free. If anything ever happened to Andrew, if he was ever pushed too far, there was now a paper trail sitting outside their control. And this is actually where it gets kind of brilliant when you think about it. Andrew never used the document. He never leaked it. He never even told his own children it existed. The power of it wasn't in exposing anyone, it was in existing at all. It was insurance, a quiet, permanent reminder that the man they'd turned into a public failure actually held proof of exactly how calculated his humiliation had been. This is the same instinct that shaped everything else he did in the years that followed. When the palace pressured him into a quiet, quick second marriage to Rosemary Pittman in 1996, in exchange for securing his children, Tom and Laura, a future inside royal circles, Andrew accepted the terms without complaint. When his own cardiovascular diagnosis in November of 1994 suggested he might not survive the decade, he still chose to walk away from the marriage with nothing, so Camilla wouldn't be left legally tangled to a dying man with a mountain of debt. Every single one of these moves looked from the outside like surrender, a man simply accepting his fate. But underneath all of it was the same quiet calculation: protect the people who mattered, take the loss personally, and keep one piece of leverage locked away where nobody could touch it. That's the real countermove here. Not a confrontation, not a lawsuit. A 30-year silence built entirely on Andrew's own terms with an insurance policy the palace never knew he was holding. And for 3 decades, that arrangement held. Andrew disappeared from the frame. Charles and Camilla built their public life, and the machinery that orchestrated all of it assumed the file in that locker would simply stay there forever, unread and forgotten. But there was one moment decades later where the distance the palace worked so hard to maintain became visible to absolutely everyone in the room, and that's where the real signal finally got sent. And here's the thing, nobody announced anything, nobody made a statement, but the message was completely clear to anyone paying attention. Picture a private reception at St. James's Palace in early 2026. Andrew is seated at a round table with senior military staff there in his capacity as a former commander of the Household Cavalry. Queen Camilla enters the room to greet guests, moving table by table with her private secretary at her side, working the room the way royals always do at these events. When she reaches the military section, her staff smoothly redirects her path toward the foreign attachés, instead steering her around Andrew's chair by several yards. No confrontation, no awkward pause that anyone in the room would even register as unusual. Just a seamless, practiced adjustment that moved her completely around the one man who 30 years earlier had been legally married to her, to an outsider that might look like nothing. Genuinely nothing at all. But in the royal world, every single gesture like that carries meaning because nothing at these events happens by accident. The official protocol records from the Lord Chamberlain's office show Andrew is consistently listed on the guest registers for major state occasions. He still receives the formal invitations his rank entitles him to. But his seating placement is always calculated with mathematical precision, positioned several rows behind the working royals, close enough to satisfy protocol, far enough to guarantee he never appears in the same television frame as the woman who used to be his wife. That's the real signal here. This isn't hostility. It's something colder and more deliberate, an institution that spent 30 years engineering distance between Andrew and the royal narrative and is still actively maintaining that distance decades later down to the exact number of feet between two chairs at a private reception nobody outside that room would ever hear about. And here's what makes it land even harder. Andrew never asked for that distance. He never demanded to be kept out of the frame. He simply accepted the terms he agreed to back in 1995 and never once broke them. The palace, on the other hand, never stopped managing him. Not for a single year, not even after Camilla became queen. The clip of this exact moment eventually made its way into royal commentary circles, slowed down, replayed, picked apart by people trying to read meaning into a single redirected walk across a room because what it showed underneath the surface politeness was uncomfortable. An institution still quietly working 30 years on to keep one loyal, silent man exactly where they'd placed him from the very beginning. But that redirected walk across a reception room was about to be the least interesting part of what happened next because somewhere behind the scenes, the machinery built to keep this story buried was starting to show cracks nobody expected. And here's where the strategy the palace had run for 30 years finally started to fall apart quietly and almost accidentally. Because the entire arrangement only worked as long as one condition held, Andrew Parker Bowles had to remain financially and socially isolated enough that nobody ever went looking for his side of the story. For 3 decades, that held perfectly. He kept his mouth shut. He never sold a quote. He never corrected a single tabloid headline that painted him as the complacent husband who let it all happen. But here's where the plan actually started slipping. A penniless brigadier with a grievance and no assets left has honestly nothing left to lose. And the people managing this situation from inside the palace, Andrew himself referred to them as the gray men, never fully accounted for what that meant. They'd successfully stripped him of Middlewick House, his financial security, his public reputation. What they didn't realize was that in doing so, they'd created a man with total freedom to eventually speak whenever he decided the moment was right. By the time Andrew reached 86 years old, decades of managed silence had built something the palace couldn't control anymore, a man with nothing left to protect except the truth itself. His children were grown secure and fully established in their own lives. Tom had built a respected career as a food writer with Charles as his own godfather. Laura had built her career managing major London art galleries. Every promise the palace made in exchange for Andrew's silence had already been fulfilled years ago. Which meant the leverage the palace once held over him, protect your children's future by staying quiet, had simply expired. There was nothing left for them to threaten him with. No file, no financial pressure, no Operation Ironclad extract could touch a man who had already secured everything he set out to protect. And that's the part the gray men never planned for. Their entire strategy depended on permanent leverage. But leverage built on protecting someone else eventually runs out once that someone else is safe. Andrew Parker Bowles spent 30 years being managed by an institution that assumed his silence was guaranteed forever when really it was only ever guaranteed until his children no longer needed protecting. So now, sitting with a leather-bound journal finally open on the desk in front of him, Andrew holds something the palace spent 3 decades trying to prevent from ever existing, a version of events with nothing left to lose by telling it and nobody left who needs him to stay quiet to keep it that way. But even now at 86, he hasn't published a single word. And that hesitation itself says something the palace probably doesn't want examined too closely. No statement, no press conference, no dramatic reveal. Just a small blue identity card issued by the Royal Parks Administration that tells you everything about where Andrew Parker Bowles actually stands today. That card grants him unrestricted personal access to the private grounds of Hyde Park Barracks at any hour, day or night. And this is not a standard courtesy extended to retired officers who've been out of active command for over 3 decades. Security logs at the barracks gate show Andrew uses this pass at least once a month, almost always arriving after dark, once the horses are settled in their stalls for the night. He walks through the stables, he talks quietly with young troopers, he checks the tack rooms the way he did decades ago as a commanding officer. The palace security team logs every entry and exit with forensic precision, tracking his movements through closed-circuit cameras across the compound. They know exactly why he's there. He's not gathering information. He's not planning to leak anything to the press. He's simply returning to the one place in his entire life where his name still carries its original weight, completely separate from the multi-billion-pound institution that took his home, his marriage, and 30 years of his public reputation. And that's it. That's the whole thing. No confrontation, no reconciliation, no final dramatic act of defiance. Just an 86-year-old man walking through familiar stables in the dark, keeping every single promise he made to the gray men back in 1995, while quietly holding a journal and a locked, time-stamped document that prove exactly how calculated his silence really was. He never published a memoir. He never sold his story. He never corrected the record even after Camilla became queen and the palace no longer had any real reason left to fear him. He simply chose to keep the private version of events exactly where it's always been locked away unread, existing only as proof to himself that the story he lived through wasn't the one the country was sold. And when you sit with that for a second, it becomes the most quietly devastating detail in this entire story. Andrew Parker Bowles wasn't defeated by the palace. He outlasted his own terminal diagnosis. He outlasted his own public humiliation. He secured his children's entire future. And in the end, he chose silence not because he had no other option left, but because he'd already gotten everything he actually wanted out of the arrangement 30 years ago. The palace thought they were containing a threat. What they were actually managing the entire time was a man who had already made peace with the outcome long before they ever sat him down in that London law office. But what this entire arrangement actually reveals about how the modern monarchy protects itself, that's a much bigger question than one man's silence. When you step back and look at the entire chain of events, what you actually see is a monarchy that survived not through scandal management, but through the quiet sacrifice of a man nobody was ever supposed to think about twice. Because this was never really a story about a marriage falling apart. This was about an institution discovering in 1995 exactly how much it could ask one loyal person to give up in order to protect its own financial structure. And Andrew Parker Bowles gave up almost everything: his home, his public reputation. 30 years of being publicly branded a failure when the private truth was the opposite. A man who protected his ex-wife's financial future, secured his children's entire lives, and carried the weight of a national tragedy used against him as leverage without ever once breaking. Who actually won here depends entirely on how you measure winning. Charles secured his marriage, his throne, and decades of carefully managed public rehabilitation for Camilla. The institution protected the Duchy of Cornwall from ever facing public scrutiny. On paper, that looks like total victory, but Andrew walked away with something the palace never accounted for. The one thing money and reputation management can't actually buy, which is knowing exactly what happened and choosing on his own terms what to do with that knowledge. And that's really what this story is about underneath everything else. Not romance. Not betrayal in the way tabloids sold it. Institutional survival built on the willingness of ordinary loyal people to absorb consequences that were never really theirs to carry so the people at the top could keep their version of events clean. Diana understood this before almost anyone else did. That warning she gave Andrew in that rain-soaked tin in 1991 that they were both being treated as operational variables turned out to be the most accurate description of the entire 30-year arrangement that followed. She saw the machine for what it was years before Andrew ever held proof of it in his own hands. So when people ask why Andrew Parker Bowles stayed silent for 40 years, the real answer isn't weakness. And it isn't even really loyalty to the crown anymore. It's that he already got what he actually wanted out of it. His children protected his ex-wife, secure his fallen soldiers' honor left untouched. Everything else, the public humiliation, the isolation, the empty bank account, was simply the price of that outcome. He's 86 years old now. He still walks through the Hyde Park barrack stables after dark, still checks on the horses, still says nothing publicly decades after anyone actually needed him to. That was never surrender. That was the deal he made, and he never once broke it.